I stood at the registration table in my best navy dress, clutching the invitation I'd treasured for months. The young woman with the clipboard scanned her list twice, her brow furrowing deeper each time. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but your name isn't here." My heart stopped. 27 years of raising my son David and I wasn't on his wedding guest list. When I found him adjusting his boutonniere, his cold response shattered me. "Did you really think you'd be invited?" I smiled calmly and walked away, but revenge was already brewing. That navy dress wasn't just any dress. I'd bought it 3 months earlier at JCPenney using money I'd saved from skipping meals. It was the most expensive piece of clothing I'd owned in 5 years, and I'd chosen it specifically for David's wedding. As I walked through that parking lot in Greenwich, Connecticut, the weight of 27 years crashed down on me like a collapsing building. David wasn't born into privilege. When his father Marcus walked out on us, David was barely 3 years old. I can still see his little face pressed against our apartment window, asking when Daddy was coming home. The answer was never, but I couldn't tell a toddler that his father had decided we weren't worth sticking around for. Instead, I told David that sometimes people have to go away, but the people who really love you will always stay. What a lie that turned out to be. I raised David in a 1-bedroom apartment above Santelli's Pizza in downtown Buffalo. The smell of garlic and oregano was our constant companion, and the sound of delivery trucks rattling our windows became our lullaby. I worked double shifts at Murphy's Diner on Elmwood Avenue, pouring coffee for construction workers at 5 in the morning, and serving late-night pie to college students until midnight. My hands were permanently stained with coffee and my feet ached constantly, but David never went to bed hungry. When David turned 8, he asked why other kids had nicer clothes and bigger houses. I knelt down in our tiny kitchen, surrounded by discount groceries and secondhand furniture, and told him something I believed with every fiber of my being. Material things don't make a person valuable, sweetheart. What makes you special is your heart, your kindness, and how you treat other people. He nodded solemnly, wrapping his small arms around my neck. The irony of those words would haunt me for decades. High school brought new challenges. David was brilliant testing into advanced placement classes and earning recognition as valedictorian. I was so proud I cried during his graduation speech. But academic success required resources we didn't have. When David needed a laptop for his college applications, I sold my grandmother's pearl necklace, the only valuable thing I owned. When he needed money for SAT prep courses, I took a 3rd job cleaning offices on weekends. When Northwestern University accepted him with partial scholarship, leaving us with $15,000 in yearly expenses, I sold my grandmother's engagement ring and took out loans that would follow me for the next decade. David thrived at Northwestern. He called me every Sunday during his freshman year, excited about his economics classes and new friends. He'd describe the beautiful campus, the intelligent professors, the opportunities opening up before him. I'd listen while stirring pasta sauce in our unchanged kitchen, living vicariously through his experiences in a world I could never access. Everything changed when David met Madison Blackwood during his junior year. The first time David mentioned her, I knew something was different. His voice carried a new tone, something I couldn't quite identify. Madison wasn't just any college girlfriend. She was the daughter of Harold and Patricia Blackwood, Connecticut real estate royalty worth approximately $50 million. Their family owned shopping centers, luxury apartment complexes, and vacation properties throughout New England. Initially, David seemed almost embarrassed by Madison's wealth. "She's really down to earth, Mom. She doesn't care about money." But gradually his perspective shifted. His Sunday phone calls became less frequent, dropping to every other week, then monthly. When he did call, conversations felt strained, as if he was performing rather than talking. During David's senior year, I planned to visit campus for Parents' Weekend. I'd saved money for months, excited to see where my son was building his future. 2 days before my trip, David called with a stammering excuse. "Actually, Mom, Madison's parents are visiting that weekend too, and it might be awkward with everyone here at once. Maybe next time." There was never a next time. After graduation, David moved directly to Madison's family estate in Greenwich. He landed a position at a prestigious investment firm, which I later learned was owned by Madison's uncle. Our relationship became increasingly distant. Holiday visits to Buffalo stopped. Phone calls became text messages, then silence. The transformation was gradual but unmistakable. David began speaking differently, using words and phrases that sounded foreign coming from the boy I'd raised. He'd mention restaurants that cost more than my weekly salary and vacations to places I couldn't pronounce. When I asked about his life, his responses became vague and dismissive. The real blow came 18 months ago. I'd called David to tell him about my arthritis diagnosis, hoping for some sympathy or support. Instead, he sighed heavily and said, "Mom, you really need to learn to handle your problems independently. Madison and I are building a life together, and we can't be constantly dealing with family drama." Family drama, that's what my health concerns had become. The wedding invitation arrived 6 months later, elegant and expensive, with gold embossing and tissue paper lining. For a moment, seeing David's name in beautiful calligraphy, I felt included again. I imagined walking down the aisle wearing my navy dress, watching my son promise his life to someone he loved. I pictured Madison's family welcoming me, perhaps realizing that David's mother wasn't the embarrassment he'd made me out to be. But even then, warning signs were present. The invitation was addressed only to Rose Murphy, not Mrs. Rose Murphy or Ms. Rosemary Murphy. It felt impersonal, almost reluctant. There was no handwritten note from David, no expression of excitement about sharing his special day with me. Just the formal invitation mailed from Greenwich like an obligation. Now, standing in that parking lot, I understood the truth. The invitation wasn't meant to include me in David's wedding. It was meant to humiliate me publicly, to demonstrate once and for all that I had no place in his new world. David knew I'd drive 5 hours from Buffalo, knew I'd buy a new dress, knew I'd arrive hopeful and excited just so he could crush me in front of Madison's family and friends. My son had become someone I didn't recognize, someone willing to inflict deliberate cruelty on the woman who'd sacrificed everything for his success. But as I sat in my 15-year-old Honda Civic watching wealthy guests stream into the Blackwood estate, something hardened inside me. David had underestimated the woman who'd raised him. He'd forgotten the strength and determination that had carried us through 24 years of struggle. He was about to receive a very painful reminder. The Blackwood estate sprawled across 43 acres of manicured Connecticut landscape, complete with a circular driveway lined with marble statues and topiary gardens that probably cost more to maintain than my annual salary. As I pulled up in my dented Honda, valet attendants in crisp white jackets approached with barely concealed confusion. One young man stared at my car for a full 10 seconds, as if trying to determine whether I was lost or delivering something. "I'm here for the Blackwood Murphy wedding," I announced, stepping out and smoothing my navy dress. The attendant's expression shifted to polite bewilderment, but he accepted my keys with professional courtesy. The estate's main house rose before me like something from a European fairy tale, complete with ivy-covered walls, mullioned windows, and a grand entrance that could have accommodated a small airplane. Guests moved across the grounds in clusters, the women draped in designer gowns that cost more than my monthly rent, the men sporting suits that fit with the precision of architectural blueprints. I felt like an intruder at a museum gala. The registration table was positioned beneath a white silk tent, adorned with cascading white roses and crystal chandeliers. 3 young women in matching pink dresses managed the guest list with military efficiency, their smiles bright and practiced. I approached the middle station where a blonde girl who couldn't have been older than 22 greeted me warmly. "Good afternoon, name please." "Rosemary Murphy." I said, my voice carrying more confidence than I felt. She scanned the alphabetized list once, then twice, her perfectly penciled eyebrows drawing together in concentration. "Could you spell that for me?" "Murphy, Rosemary." Another scan, more thorough this time. She consulted a second clipboard, then glanced at her colleagues with growing concern. "I'm terribly sorry, ma'am, but I don't see your name on our guest list. Could there be another spelling? Perhaps a nickname." My chest tightened, but I maintained my composure. "Rose Murphy. Mrs. Murphy. I'm David's mother." Recognition flickered across her face, followed immediately by awkward sympathy. She'd obviously been briefed about the difficult mother situation. Her voice dropped to a whisper as she leaned forward conspiratorially. "Let me check with the wedding coordinator," she murmured, reaching for her walkie-talkie. "That won't be necessary." I interrupted my pride, refusing to allow further humiliation. "I'll speak with David directly." The girl looked relieved to escape the uncomfortable situation. "Of course he should be in the groom's preparation room in the East Wing." I navigated through the crowd, acutely aware of how my $15 Walmart dress stood out among the sea of designer clothing. Conversations paused as I passed, and I caught fragments of whispered speculation. "Who is that woman?" "She doesn't look like she belongs here." "Is she from the catering staff?" The east wing of the house was quieter, with fewer guests wandering the marble corridors, lined with oil paintings worth more than my lifetime earnings. I found the groom's preparation room after asking directions from a server carrying champagne flutes on a silver tray. Through the partially open door, I could see David adjusting his boutonniere in front of an antique mirror. He looked handsome in his custom tuxedo, every inch the successful young professional. For a moment, my maternal pride overrode my hurt. This was my son, the little boy I'd raised to be kind and compassionate, standing on the threshold of his new life. I knocked softly. "David." He turned, and his expression transformed instantly from concentration to annoyance. "Mom, what are you doing here?" The coldness in his voice struck me like a physical blow. "I came for your wedding, sweetheart. But there seems to be some mistake with the guest list." David's jaw tightened as he glanced toward the door, clearly concerned about being overheard. He stepped closer, lowering his voice to a harsh whisper. "There's no mistake, Mother." The word mother sounded like an insult the way he pronounced it, formal and distant. Gone was Mom, the name he'd used for 26 years. "I don't understand," I said, though part of me was beginning to understand perfectly. David rolled his eyes with theatrical exasperation, the same expression he'd used as a teenager when I'd embarrassed him in front of his friends. "Did you really think you'd be invited? Come on, be realistic." The words hit me like ice water. I stared at my son, searching for any trace of the compassionate boy I'd raised. Instead, I saw a stranger wearing David's face, someone who'd learned to view his own mother as an inconvenience. "I raised you," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I sacrificed everything for you." "And I'm grateful," David replied with practiced insincerity. "But Madison's family has certain expectations. This wedding is important for my career, my future. I can't have—" He gestured vaguely at my dress, my appearance, my entire existence. "I can't have distractions." Distractions. That's what I'd become. I felt something crack inside my chest, not my heart breaking, but something harder and more permanent. The last thread connecting me to the illusion that my son still existed somewhere beneath this cold stranger finally snapped. "I understand perfectly," I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. David looked surprised by my calm reaction. He'd expected tears, arguments, pleading. Instead, I smiled with genuine serenity, the expression of someone who just received crucial information. "Good," he said, relief evident in his voice. "I'm glad you're being reasonable about this." I turned to leave, then paused. "David, I want you to know that everything I did, every sacrifice I made was done out of love. I hope someday you remember what that feels like." Before he could respond, I walked away, leaving him standing in his expensive suit in his expensive room, about to marry into his expensive new family. But as I made my way back through the marble corridors, I wasn't thinking about my pain anymore. I was thinking about justice. The walk back through the crowd felt different now. I held my head high, no longer caring about the whispers or stares. These people didn't matter. Their opinions didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was the plan forming in my mind piece by piece, like a puzzle finally revealing its complete picture. Near the garden fountain, I paused to collect my thoughts. The fountain was an elaborate marble creation featuring cherubs and dolphins' water, cascading in perfectly choreographed patterns. It was here that I overheard the conversation that would change everything. Two men in expensive suits stood partially hidden behind a hedge of sculpted boxwood, their voices carrying clearly in the afternoon air. One was Harold Blackwood Madison's father, whom I recognized from society page photographs. The other was a distinguished gentleman I didn't recognize. $50 grand was worth it to make sure that woman stays away from our family. Harold was saying, his tone casual, as if discussing a minor business transaction. "Madison can't be associated with trailer trash." My blood turned to ice. "Smart investment." The other man agreed. "The boy earned his money. He's completely cut ties." They were talking about David. They were talking about me. Harold Blackwood had paid my son $50,000 to disown his own mother. I remained frozen behind the fountain, afraid to move and reveal my presence. Harold continued, his voice filled with satisfaction. "Madison was worried about the mother problem, but David handled it perfectly. Complete severance. The woman will never be part of their lives." "What if she makes trouble?" the other man asked. Harold chuckled dismissively. "Look at her, a diner waitress from Buffalo. She doesn't have the resources or connections to cause any real problems. She'll cry for a while, then disappear back to whatever hole she crawled out of." The casual cruelty of his words was breathtaking. To Harold Blackwood, I wasn't a human being with feelings and dignity. I was simply an obstacle that had been efficiently removed through financial incentive. But Harold Blackwood had made a critical error in judgment. He'd assumed that working-class people were weak, easily defeated, lacking in intelligence or determination. He'd never encountered a woman who'd spent 27 years fighting for her child, who'd learned to be resourceful and tenacious through sheer necessity. I slipped away from the fountain undetected, my mind racing with implications. David hadn't just rejected me out of embarrassment or social climbing. He'd been financially incentivized to cut me out of his life. My son had literally been paid to abandon me. The hurt was transforming into something else now, something colder and more focused. These people thought they could buy their way out of any inconvenience, including the inconvenience of a loving mother. They thought money could solve every problem, and that people like me were too powerless to fight back. They were about to discover how wrong they were. As I walked toward my Honda Civic, I was already planning my next moves. I had the advantage of being underestimated, dismissed as harmless. Harold and Madison and even David had no idea what they were dealing with. They saw a simple woman in a cheap dress and assumed that was all there was to see. But I'd spent 27 years learning how to survive, how to persevere, how to protect what mattered most to me. Those skills didn't disappear just because I'd been betrayed. If anything, they were about to become more important than ever. The valet brought my car around and I tipped him $5, probably the smallest tip he'd received all day. But he accepted it graciously, perhaps sensing that unlike the wealthy guests, this $5 actually mattered to me. As I drove away from the Blackwood estate, I glanced in my rearview mirror at the fairy tale house, where my son was about to pledge his life to a woman whose family had purchased his loyalty. The wedding would continue, the guests would celebrate, and David would believe he'd successfully eliminated the embarrassment of his working-class background. Let him believe it. Let them all believe it. Because while they were celebrating, I was going to war. The 5-hour drive from Greenwich back to Buffalo gave me plenty of time to think, and by the time I reached my apartment above Santelli's Pizza, my hurt had crystallized into something much more dangerous, cold, calculating determination. I didn't cry. I didn't call friends for sympathy. Instead, I made a pot of coffee and began planning the systematic destruction of everyone who had betrayed me. My first stop was the Buffalo Public Library. I'd always been good with research, a skill I'd developed helping David with school projects throughout his childhood. Now, I was going to use that skill for a very different purpose. The library's computer terminals gave me access to public records, social media platforms, and news databases. I started with David's financial history, using information I still possessed from his college years when I'd helped him navigate student loans and banking procedures. What I discovered made my blood boil. David had been systematically stealing from me for 2 years. When he'd turned 18, I'd added him as a beneficiary to my savings account, thinking it would help him access emergency funds during college. I'd forgotten to remove his access after graduation, and David had been exploiting that oversight ever since. Monthly withdrawals of varying amounts, always small enough to avoid triggering bank alerts, but totaling $38,000 over 24 months. $38,000, more than I earned in an entire year at Murphy's Diner. Bank records showed the money had been transferred to David's personal checking account, then used for luxury purchases, a $15,000 Rolex watch, custom suits from a Madison Avenue tailor, and a $12,000 engagement ring for Madison. My son had stolen my retirement savings to buy gifts for his wealthy girlfriend and accessories for his new lifestyle. The betrayal was so complete, so calculated, that I had to step outside the library to get fresh air. I'd raised a thief, someone who would rob his own mother to impress people who already had everything. But David's theft was just the beginning of what I discovered. I spent 3 days researching the Blackwood family, uncovering layer after layer of corruption and criminal activity. Harold Blackwood's real estate empire was built on decades of tax evasion, money laundering, and fraudulent development schemes. Property records showed suspicious transactions involving shell companies and offshore accounts. Newspaper archives revealed multiple investigations that had been mysteriously dropped, lawsuits that had been settled out of court, and whistleblowers who had suddenly disappeared from public view. The Blackwoods were criminals, sophisticated ones, who used their wealth and connections to escape consequences for their actions. On Thursday afternoon, I made a phone call that would change everything. Frank Murphy had been my late husband's older brother, a retired Buffalo police detective who'd spent 32 years investigating white-collar crime. Frank had always been kind to me, and unlike the rest of Marcus's family, he'd maintained contact after Marcus abandoned us. Frank was 71 now, living in a modest house near Delaware Park, but his mind remained sharp and his connections in law enforcement were still solid. "Rosemary." Frank's voice warmed when he heard me on the phone. How are you holding up, sweetheart? I need help, Frank, and I need someone I can trust absolutely. Something in my tone must have alerted him to the seriousness of the situation. What's wrong? I told him everything: David's rejection, the stolen money, the Blackwood family's corruption, Harold's casual admission about paying David to disown me. Frank listened without interruption, his detective instincts engaging. Son of a bitch, he muttered when I finished. Excuse my language, but that's exactly what this is. Financial elder abuse conspiracy fraud. How much evidence do you have? Banking records, transaction histories, some public documents, but I need more. Meet me at Tim Hortons on Elmwood in an hour, and Rosemary, don't do anything else until we talk. Frank arrived at the coffee shop carrying a worn leather briefcase and wearing the same serious expression I remembered from David's childhood when he'd helped me navigate legal issues after Marcus left. But now that expression was focused on helping me fight back. First thing you need to understand, Frank said, sliding into the booth across from me, is that people like the Blackwoods think they're untouchable. They've bought their way out of trouble for so long that they've gotten sloppy. That's good for us. He pulled a small device from his briefcase no bigger than a matchbox. Digital recorder. Voice-activated, 8 hours of storage, completely legal to use in New York State, as long as you're part of the conversation being recorded. My heart pounded as Frank explained how to operate the device. You're going to contact David. Play the heartbroken mother. Apologize for embarrassing him at the wedding. Beg for forgiveness. Make him feel like he's won completely. I don't know if I can do that convincingly. Frank's weathered face creased into a grim smile. Rosemary, you raised that boy for 27 years. You know exactly which buttons to push to make him comfortable and overconfident. Use that knowledge. Over the next 2 hours, Frank outlined a comprehensive investigation strategy. His contacts in law enforcement could access records that weren't available to the public. His former partner in the FBI white-collar crime unit owed him favors and would be interested in building a case against the Blackwood family. But here's the key, Frank emphasized, leaning forward intently. We can't just go after David for stealing your money. That's small-time stuff. We need to uncover the bigger picture, the entire criminal enterprise. That way, when we bring them down, they stay down. Frank's plan was elegant in its simplicity. I would approach David and Madison playing the role of the defeated, apologetic mother who just wanted to make amends before they left for their honeymoon in Switzerland. During these interactions, I would gather evidence of their crimes while making them believe I posed no threat. Meanwhile, Frank would use his law enforcement connections to investigate the Blackwood family's financial crimes and build a case that would interest federal prosecutors. The stolen money from my account would be just one piece of evidence in a much larger criminal conspiracy. One more thing, Frank said as we prepared to leave Tim Hortons. You need to be prepared for this to get ugly. When cornered people like this don't go quietly, they'll try to destroy your reputation, claim you're lying, or mentally unstable. Are you strong enough to handle that? I thought about David's cold dismissal, Harold's casual cruelty, the $38,000 stolen from my retirement savings. Frank, I've been handling ugly for 27 years. These people have no idea what they're dealing with. Frank grinned, and for a moment I saw the tough cop who'd spent 3 decades putting criminals behind bars. That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say. That evening, I called David's cell phone. It rang 4 times before he answered, his voice cautious and slightly annoyed. Mom, what do you want? I took a deep breath and channeled every acting skill I possessed. David, honey, I'm calling to apologize. I was so embarrassed about what happened at your wedding. I should have realized that showing up uninvited was inappropriate. Silence on the other end, then. Okay, I appreciate that. I've been thinking about what you said about being realistic about my place in your life. You're right. I was being selfish expecting to be included in something so important to your career. David's voice relaxed slightly. I'm glad you understand. Could we meet for coffee sometime? I'd like to apologize properly and maybe give you and Madison a wedding gift. I know I embarrassed you, but I want to make things right before you leave for your honeymoon. The offer of a gift caught his attention immediately. What kind of gift? Well, I've been saving money and I thought maybe I could help with your new life together. Nothing extravagant, but something meaningful. David's greed overcame his caution. We could meet Saturday afternoon. There's a Starbucks near our apartment. Perfect. And David, I really am sorry. I love you so much and I just want you to be happy. Thanks, Mom. I'll see you Saturday. After hanging up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, staring at the digital recorder Frank had given me. In 2 days, I would begin the most difficult performance of my life, pretending to forgive the son who had sold me for $50,000 while secretly gathering evidence to destroy him. The old Rosemary would have been horrified by what I was planning, but the old Rosemary was gone killed by her son's betrayal and buried in a parking lot in Greenwich, Connecticut. The woman who remained was someone new, someone harder and more dangerous. Someone who understood that justice sometimes requires getting your hands dirty. Saturday afternoon arrived with the crisp bite of early autumn in Buffalo. I dressed carefully for my meeting with David, choosing a worn cardigan and faded jeans that would reinforce his perception of me as defeated and harmless. The digital recorder was tucked securely in my purse, already activated according to Frank's instructions. The Starbucks near David's apartment was busy with weekend customers, families with young children, and college students hunched over laptops. I arrived 15 minutes early and chose a corner table that would provide privacy for our conversation, while allowing the recorder to capture everything clearly. David walked in precisely on time, dressed in casual clothes that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. He scanned the coffee shop until he spotted me, then approached with the cautious demeanor of someone fulfilling an unpleasant obligation. Hi, Mom. He leaned down for an awkward half hug that felt like embracing a stranger. Thank you for meeting with me, honey. I kept my voice soft and grateful. Can I buy you a coffee? David accepted ordering a complex drink with multiple specifications while I stuck with black coffee. As we settled at the corner table, I began my performance. I've had 2 weeks to think about everything, and I realize how unfair I was to you. The words tasted like poison, but I delivered them with perfect sincerity. You've worked so hard to build a successful life, and I was being selfish expecting to be part of your wedding. David's shoulders relaxed slightly. He'd been prepared for conflict, not capitulation. I appreciate you saying that, Mom. It means a lot. Madison seems lovely. I'm sure she's perfect for you. I pulled a small wrapped box from my purse. I brought you both a little something. Inside the box was a silver picture frame from the dollar store containing a photo of David from his high school graduation. David's expression softened as he looked at the picture. I know it's not much, I continued, but I thought you might like to have it for your new home. It's nice, Mom, really. The gift was working exactly as Frank had predicted. By giving David something sentimental and inexpensive, I was reinforcing his image of me as a simple woman who posed no threat to his sophisticated new life. I've also been thinking about your future, I said, leaning forward conspiratorially. You and Madison are starting your married life, and I want to help if I can. David's eyes sharpened with interest. Help how? Well, I know I don't have much, but I've been saving money for years. I was thinking of giving you and Madison my entire savings account as a wedding gift. It's not a fortune, but it might help with your honeymoon or setting up your home. This was the crucial moment. David knew he'd been stealing from that account for 2 years, but he also knew I didn't know about the theft. If he was the decent person I'd raised him to be, he would refuse the gift or confess to taking the money. Instead, he did something that confirmed his complete moral bankruptcy. Mom, that's incredibly generous. How much are we talking about? About $42,000. I know it's not much by your standards now, but $42,000 would actually be really helpful right now. David interrupted, his voice brightening with excitement. Madison and I are looking at some investment opportunities, and having extra capital would be perfect. I stared at my son, genuinely shocked despite everything I'd learned about his character. He was willing to accept money from the savings account he'd already been robbing, effectively stealing from me twice. The recorder in my purse was capturing every word of his enthusiastic agreement to take money that was rightfully mine. There's just one thing, I said carefully. I'd need you to help me access the account. I'm not very good with modern banking, and I want to make sure the transfer goes smoothly. David's expression flickered with something that might have been guilt, but it passed quickly. Sure, Mom. I can help you with that. We spent the next hour discussing the logistics of the money transfer with David, providing detailed instructions that clearly demonstrated his familiarity with my banking information. He knew my account numbers, my security questions, even the location of the branch where I'd opened the account 23 years earlier. You seem to know a lot about my banking, I observed innocently. David shifted uncomfortably. Well, I helped you set up some of these accounts when I was in college, remember? Plus, I've been managing my own finances for years now. This stuff becomes second nature. As our conversation continued, David became increasingly comfortable, apparently convinced that I was exactly what I appeared to be, a simple woman overwhelmed by gratitude that her successful son was willing to speak with her at all. His guard dropped completely, and he began sharing details about his life that revealed the extent of his transformation. Madison's family has been incredibly welcoming, he said, his voice full of satisfaction. Her father offered me a position in his real estate development company. The starting salary is more than I made in my previous job, plus bonuses and equity opportunities. That sounds wonderful, honey. And we're looking at houses in some really exclusive neighborhoods. Madison wants to be close to her family, which makes sense given how successful they are. David leaned back in his chair, radiating confidence. I'm finally living the life I was meant to live, no more worrying about money or struggling to make ends meet. The casual dismissal of our years of struggle hit me like a physical blow. David was talking about our shared history as if it had been an unfortunate mistake, rather than the foundation of his character and values. But I maintained my grateful, humble expression. I'm so proud of you, David. You've accomplished everything I dreamed of for you. Thanks, Mom. I know this transition has been hard for you, but it's for the best. Madison and I are planning to move to Switzerland after our honeymoon. Her family has business interests there, and the opportunities are incredible. Switzerland. They were planning to flee the country with their stolen money, putting an ocean between themselves and any potential consequences for their crimes. Switzerland sounds amazing, I said wistfully, like something from a fairy tale. It really is. Madison has connections there, and her family has been working on some major international deals. It's the kind of opportunity most people only dream about. David continued talking about his bright future, completely oblivious to the fact that he was confessing to financial crimes and conspiracy to commit fraud. The recorder captured every word as he described plans that clearly involve the Blackwood family's criminal enterprises. When we finally parted ways, David hugged me with what seemed like genuine warmth. Thanks for being so understanding about everything, Mom. I know this hasn't been easy for you. I just want you to be happy, sweetheart. I am happy, happier than I've ever been. As I watched David walk away, I felt a profound sadness that had nothing to do with my own pain. My son was happy because he'd betrayed everyone who loved him, stolen money from his mother, and aligned himself with criminals. The person I'd raised was truly gone, replaced by someone I didn't recognize. But sadness was a luxury I couldn't afford. I had work to do. That evening, I met Frank at a small Italian restaurant near his house. We sat in a back booth while Frank listened to the recorded conversation through earphones connected to the digital device. "Outstanding work," he said when the recording finished. David just confessed to conspiracy to commit fraud, financial elder abuse, and money laundering. Plus, he gave us details about the Blackwood family's Swiss operation. "What's our next move?" Frank's smile was predatory. "We're going to arrange for you to meet Madison. And this time, we're going to get her talking about her family's criminal activities." "How do we do that?" "Same strategy. You're going to call David and ask to meet Madison personally to apologize for any awkwardness and to give her a special gift. Women like Madison can't resist the opportunity to humiliate someone they consider beneath them. She'll want to meet with you just for the entertainment value." Frank was right. When I called David the next day and asked to meet Madison personally, he was enthusiastic about the idea. "Madison would love to meet you properly, Mom." She felt bad about the misunderstanding at the wedding. Misunderstanding. That's what David called his deliberate exclusion of me from his wedding. We arranged to meet at Romano's, an upscale Italian restaurant in downtown Buffalo. Madison had specifically requested somewhere nice, apparently wanting to ensure that our meeting occurred in surroundings that would emphasize the gap between her world and mine. I spent the week before our dinner carefully researching Madison's background, using the investigation skills Frank had taught me. What I discovered was even worse than I'd expected. Madison Blackwood wasn't just the spoiled daughter of wealthy criminals. She was a criminal herself, with a history of elaborate fraud schemes that stretched across 3 countries and involved multiple victims. Most shocking of all, Madison was already married. Her husband was Klaus Weber, a Swiss banker who specialized in hiding money for wealthy Americans seeking to avoid taxes. Madison had married Klaus 2 years earlier in a ceremony in Zurich, using her maiden name to keep the marriage secret from American authorities. The plan was breathtaking in its audacity. Madison would marry David, establish American citizenship and access to American banks, then divorce David and return to Switzerland with both men's money. David wasn't Madison's husband. He was her mark, the latest in a series of American men she'd defrauded and abandoned. Frank's contacts in international law enforcement confirmed that Madison had used identical schemes to steal approximately $2 million from previous victims. 2 other American men had been left bankrupt and heartbroken, their savings emptied, and their faith in love destroyed. David wasn't just a willing participant in Madison's crimes. He was her victim, too blinded by her beauty and his social ambitions to recognize that he was being played. But David's victimization didn't excuse his willingness to betray his own mother. He'd made his choice when he accepted Harold Blackwood's $50,000 and stolen money from my savings account. Whatever happened to him now was the natural consequence of his own greed and cruelty. As I prepared for dinner at Romano's, I felt a cold satisfaction settle over me like armor. Madison Blackwood thought she was going to toy with a helpless old woman for her own amusement. She had no idea that she was walking into a trap that would destroy her life and expose crimes that stretched across 2 continents. The helpless old woman she planned to humiliate was about to become her worst nightmare. Romano's Italian restaurant occupied a converted Victorian mansion in Buffalo's Elmwood Village, its warm lighting and old-world charm making it popular with couples celebrating anniversaries and business professionals conducting important meetings. I arrived 30 minutes early, choosing a corner table with excellent acoustics and clear sightlines to the entrance. The digital recorder was concealed in my purse along with a backup device Frank had provided, and a cell phone programmed to speed dial his number if the situation became dangerous. I dressed conservatively in a dark blue dress and pearls, aiming for the appearance of a woman trying desperately to impress people far above her social station. David and Madison arrived precisely on time, making an entrance that turned heads throughout the restaurant. Madison wore a stunning red cocktail dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent, paired with heels that clicked authoritatively across the hardwood floors. Her blonde hair was styled in an elaborate updo, and diamond earrings caught the light as she moved. She was absolutely beautiful, and she knew it. "Mrs. Murphy." Madison's voice carried perfectly modulated warmth as she approached our table. "I'm so delighted to finally meet you properly." Her handshake was firm and confident, her smile bright enough to power the restaurant. This was a woman accustomed to getting whatever she wanted through charm and manipulation. "Please call me Rosemary," I said, playing my role as the grateful, overwhelmed mother. "Thank you so much for agreeing to meet with me. Of course David has told me so much about you." Madison's tone suggested that what David had told her was far from flattering, but she maintained her gracious facade. We ordered drinks and appetizers while engaging in polite small talk about the restaurant, the weather, and Madison's adjustment to married life. Throughout this preliminary conversation, I observed Madison carefully noting the calculating intelligence behind her beautiful exterior. This was not a woman who made impulsive decisions. Every gesture, every word was carefully chosen for maximum effect. She was performing just as deliberately as I was, though her performance was designed to establish dominance rather than gather evidence. "David mentioned that you wanted to give us a wedding gift," Madison said as our appetizers arrived. "That's incredibly thoughtful, especially considering—" She let the sentence trail off delicately, leaving unsaid the obvious conclusion that someone in my circumstances couldn't afford to be generous. "It's my pleasure," I replied, reaching into my purse for 2 carefully wrapped boxes. "I know these aren't much compared to the beautiful gifts you must have received, but I wanted to give you something special." The first box contained a Rolex watch for David II, a diamond tennis bracelet for Madison. Both items were genuine and expensive, purchased with money I'd borrowed against my apartment's equity. Frank had insisted that the gifts be impressive enough to lower their guard and establish my credibility. David's eyes widened as he opened the Rolex box. "Mom, this is incredible. This must have cost—" "Don't worry about the cost, honey. I wanted you to have something worthy of your new position in life." Madison's reaction to the diamond bracelet was even more revealing. Her practiced composure slipped for just a moment, revealing genuine surprise and greed. She clearly hadn't expected the pathetic woman from the wedding to produce anything of real value. "Rosemary, this is absolutely stunning," she breathed, examining the diamonds with expert appreciation. "You have exquisite taste." "I sold some family heirlooms to afford them," I explained, allowing a note of sacrifice to enter my voice. "I wanted David to know how proud I am of everything he's accomplished." The mention of selling family heirlooms had the intended effect. Both David and Madison relaxed, further convinced that I'd bankrupted myself to buy their approval. In their worldview, this kind of desperate generosity proved my complete harmlessness. "You didn't need to do that, Mom," David said, but his tone carried satisfaction rather than genuine concern. "I wanted to," I insisted. "You're starting such an exciting new life together, especially with your move to Switzerland." Madison's perfectly plucked eyebrows rose slightly. "David told you about Switzerland." "Just that you'll be living there permanently after your honeymoon. It sounds like a wonderful opportunity." "Oh, it is," Madison replied, her voice warming with enthusiasm. "My family has extensive business interests in Zurich. Klaus has been instrumental in helping us establish. She stopped abruptly, realizing she'd said more than intended. Klaus, I asked innocently. Madison's cheeks flushed slightly. Klaus Weber. He's a business associate of my father's. He's been helping us navigate Swiss banking regulations and investment opportunities. David nodded enthusiastically, apparently unaware of the significance of Madison's slip. The connections Madison's family has are incredible, Mom. We're looking at opportunities that could set us up for life. That sounds wonderful. What kind of opportunities? Madison shot David a warning look, but he was too excited to notice. International real estate development, currency trading, private banking services for wealthy clients. Madison's family specializes in helping Americans establish offshore financial structures. Offshore financial structures. David was describing money laundering operations without even realizing it. It sounds very sophisticated, I said admiringly. I'm sure you'll both be very successful. We will be, Madison said with quiet confidence. My family doesn't fail at anything we undertake. There was something chilling in the way she said it, a hint of the ruthless determination that had enabled her to defraud multiple victims across multiple countries. As dinner continued, both David and Madison became increasingly comfortable sharing details about their plans. David described the house they were buying in Switzerland, the business opportunities waiting for them, and the lifestyle they would enjoy far from the constraints of American law enforcement. Madison was more careful with her words, but she couldn't resist dropping hints about her family's wealth and influence. She mentioned properties in 6 different countries, business relationships with Swiss banks, and connections with government officials who ensured that certain regulatory issues were handled discreetly. Your father sounds like a remarkable businessman, I observed. Madison's smile turned predatory. Daddy is very good at getting what he wants. He's taught me that there are always ways to solve problems if you're willing to be creative and decisive. The recording device in my purse was capturing every word, every admission, every casual reference to criminal activity. But I needed more specific information, something that would provide federal prosecutors with concrete evidence of ongoing crimes. David mentioned that your father helped arrange his position at the investment firm. That was very generous. Daddy believes in investing in the right people, Madison replied. David has proven himself worthy of our family's support. How so? Madison glanced at David, who nodded encouragingly. David showed us that he understood what was important. He was willing to make difficult choices about his previous life in order to embrace his future with our family. Difficult choices? She was talking about David's decision to disown me. That must have been hard for him, I said sympathetically. Not really, Madison replied with casual cruelty. David realized that some relationships hold you back while others lift you up. He chose to surround himself with people who could help him achieve his potential. David beamed at this assessment, apparently proud of his willingness to abandon his mother for financial gain. Your family certainly seems to have welcomed David completely, I observed. We take care of our own, Madison said, and we deal decisively with people who threaten our interests. The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. Madison was warning me that any attempt to interfere with their plans would be met with retaliation. But she had no idea that her threats were being recorded or that her casual admissions about her family's criminal activities were providing exactly the evidence Frank needed to build a federal case. As we finished our main courses, Madison excused herself to use the restroom. David immediately leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Mom, I need to tell you something. Madison's family is incredible, but they're also very protective of their privacy. It's important that you don't discuss our conversation tonight with anyone else. Of course, honey, I understand completely. Good. Because Madison's father has connections that could make life very difficult for people who cause problems for their family. I'm not trying to threaten you, but I want you to understand the situation clearly. My own son was threatening me on behalf of his criminal in-laws. The transformation was complete. I would never do anything to jeopardize your happiness, David. When Madison returned from the restroom, her demeanor had shifted slightly. She seemed more alert, more focused, as if she'd used the break to reassess the situation. Rosemary, I hope you understand how fortunate you are, she said, settling back into her chair. Not many mothers get to see their sons achieve the kind of success David is experiencing. I'm very grateful, I replied humbly. Good, because gratitude is important. It keeps people focused on what they have rather than what they think they deserve. The message was clear: be grateful for whatever scraps of contact they choose to give me and don't expect anything more. We finished dinner with dessert and coffee, the conversation gradually becoming more relaxed, as Madison and David convinced themselves that I posed no threat to their plans. They discussed their honeymoon itinerary, their house hunting strategy in Switzerland, and their long-term goals for building wealth through her family's business network. By the time we parted ways in the restaurant's parking lot, both David and Madison were confident that they'd successfully managed the mother problem. They'd bought my silence with expensive gifts and intimidated me with subtle threats. In their minds, I would return to my small apartment and fade quietly into the background of their successful lives. Thank you for a lovely evening, Madison said, air-kissing my cheek with practiced grace. I hope we'll see you again before we leave for Switzerland. That would be wonderful, I replied, knowing that our next meeting would be under very different circumstances. As I drove home, I felt a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. The recording in my purse contained enough evidence to destroy Madison's criminal empire and send David to prison for financial elder abuse. But it also confirmed that my son had become someone I no longer recognized, someone willing to threaten his own mother to protect the criminals who'd purchased his loyalty. The old Rosemary would have grieved for the loss of her child's soul, but the new Rosemary, forged in betrayal and tempered by injustice, felt only cold determination. Tomorrow I would deliver the recording to Frank, and he would begin the process of bringing down everyone who had underestimated the woman they'd dismissed as harmless trailer trash. They were about to learn that the most dangerous enemies are the ones you never see coming. 3 weeks later, Frank and I sat in the Buffalo FBI field office, watching Special Agent Rebecca Martinez review the evidence we'd compiled. Agent Martinez was a 20-year veteran of white-collar crime investigation with a reputation for bringing down sophisticated criminal organizations that thought they were above the law. This is extraordinary work, she said, studying bank records, recorded conversations, and international wire transfer documentation. We've been trying to build a case against the Blackwood organization for 18 months, but they've always stayed just beyond our reach. Your evidence gives us everything we need. Frank leaned forward in his chair. What's the timeline for arrests? We'll coordinate with Swiss authorities and Interpol. The Blackwood family's international connections require careful handling, but we should be able to move within 72 hours. Agent Martinez explained the scope of the investigation that would unfold. David and Madison would be arrested for financial elder abuse, conspiracy to commit fraud, and money laundering. Harold Blackwood faced federal charges for racketeering, tax evasion, and operating a criminal enterprise. Madison's marriage to Klaus Weber in Switzerland made her guilty of bigamy and immigration fraud. What about the other victims? I asked. James Patterson in Texas and Michael Rodriguez in California will both be contacted. Their cases will be reopened as part of the larger investigation. Madison's previous victims deserve justice, too. As we left the FBI office, Frank put his arm around my shoulders. You did it, Rosemary. You brought down an entire criminal organization. We're not finished yet, I replied. I want to see their faces when they realize what's happening. Frank grinned. I was hoping you'd say that. The trap was sprung the following Saturday evening at Romano's restaurant, the same location where Madison had threatened me 3 weeks earlier. I'd called David that morning claiming I wanted to treat them to one final dinner before they left for their honeymoon. My voice carried the perfect blend of maternal affection and desperate gratitude. That's really thoughtful, Mom, David had said. We'd love to see you again before we leave. They arrived at Romano's dressed for celebration, David in an expensive suit, and Madison in a designer dress that sparkled under the restaurant's chandelier. They were glowing with the confidence of people who'd successfully executed a complex plan and were about to reap the rewards. Rosemary. Madison embraced me warmly, her performance flawless as always. You look wonderful. We ordered champagne to toast their upcoming honeymoon, and for 20 minutes, I played the role of the doting mother, sending her son off on the adventure of his lifetime. David and Madison regaled me with stories about their Swiss house, their planned investments, and their excitement about starting fresh in a new country. I have something for you both, I said as our appetizers arrived. One final gift before you begin your new life together. I handed David an envelope containing what appeared to be a cashier's check. His eyes widened as he examined the amount, $50,000. Mom, this is incredible. How did you... I liquidated everything, I said with a trembling voice. My savings, my retirement account, even took out a loan against my apartment. I wanted you to have a perfect start in Switzerland. Madison's eyes glittered with greed as she examined the check. Rosemary, this is incredibly generous. Are you sure you can afford this? I don't need much, I replied humbly. Knowing that David is happy and secure is worth more than money to me. David reached across the table to squeeze my hand. I love you, Mom. I know I haven't always shown it, but I really do appreciate everything you've sacrificed for me. For a moment, his voice carried genuine emotion, and I glimpsed the boy I'd raised before he'd been corrupted by greed and ambition. But the moment passed quickly as Madison redirected the conversation to their travel plans. We're flying out tomorrow evening, she said excitedly. First class to Zurich, then a week in Paris before we settle into our new home. It sounds like a dream come true, I said wistfully. It really is, David agreed. Sometimes I can hardly believe how perfectly everything has worked out. That's when my phone rang. I glanced at the screen with faint confusion. I'm sorry I should take this. It might be important. But instead of answering the call, I set the phone on the table and let it ring. Within seconds, David's phone began ringing too. Then Madison's. That's strange, Madison said, frowning at her phone. It's my father. Mine's showing FBI Buffalo field office. David said, his voice tight with sudden anxiety. More phones began ringing throughout the restaurant. Other diners started answering their calls, their voices rising in excitement as they received the same message. Turn on Channel 7 News immediately. The restaurant manager appeared with a remote control, switching the flat-screen television behind the bar to the local news channel. The lead story made David's face drain of all color. Federal agents arrested Connecticut real estate developer Harold Blackwood this morning on charges of money laundering, tax evasion, and racketeering. The arrest is part of a larger investigation into an international criminal organization that allegedly defrauded American citizens of more than $8 million over the past 5 years. Madison's champagne glass slipped from her hand, shattering on the hardwood floor. The news report continued with devastating efficiency. Photos of Madison appeared on screen, identified as Madison Blackwood Weber, who allegedly used fraudulent marriages to steal money from American men while maintaining a legitimate marriage to Swiss banker Klaus Weber. Authorities are also seeking David Murphy's son-in-law of Harold Blackwood on charges of financial elder abuse and conspiracy to commit fraud. Murphy allegedly stole $38,000 from his elderly mother's savings account to fund a lifestyle supported by criminal activity. David's hands were shaking as he stared at his own photograph on the television screen. "Mom, what's happening? What did you do?" I smiled calmly, the same expression I'd worn when he dismissed me from his wedding. "I did what you taught me to do, David. I chose to surround myself with people who could help me achieve my potential." Madison's beautiful facade cracked completely. "You recording bitch. You set us up." Her voice was loud enough to attract attention from nearby tables where other diners were recording our confrontation with their cell phones. The elegant Madison Blackwood was transforming before everyone's eyes into the desperate criminal she'd always been. "You were supposed to be a harmless old woman," she snarled. "You were supposed to disappear quietly and be grateful for whatever scraps we threw you." "I was never harmless," I replied evenly. "You just made the mistake of thinking that working class meant weak." David tried one last manipulation, his voice breaking with apparent anguish. "Mom, I'm sorry about everything. I know I made mistakes, but I'm still your son. You can't destroy your own family." "I'm not destroying my family, David. I'm cleaning house. Real family doesn't steal from each other. Real family doesn't sell each other for $50,000. The color drained from his face as he realized I knew about Harold's payment. "How could you possibly—" "I know everything, David. About the money you stole, about Madison's husband in Switzerland, about your plans to flee the country with stolen funds. I know about Harold's criminal empire and Madison's previous victims and the offshore accounts in 6 different countries." Police sirens were audible in the distance, growing louder by the second. Madison jumped to her feet, her chair toppling backward. "This isn't over, you miserable old bitch. My family has resources you can't imagine. We'll destroy you." "Your family is finished," I said calmly. "Harold was arrested 6 hours ago. Your Swiss accounts have been frozen by Interpol. Klaus Weber is in custody in Zurich, and he's been very cooperative about explaining your bigamous marriage scheme." Buffalo police officers entered the restaurant, moving directly toward our table. David tried to run, but there was nowhere to go. Madison attempted to maintain her dignity, even as handcuffs clicked around her wrists, but her composure was completely shattered. "David Murphy and Madison Blackwood Weber, you're under arrest," announced Detective Sarah Johnson, reading them their rights, while the entire restaurant watched in fascination. As the officers led David and Madison away, David turned back toward me with the expression of complete bewilderment. "I don't understand, Mom. I thought you loved me." "I do love you," I said sadly. "That's why I'm letting you face the consequences of your choices. It's the only chance you have of becoming the person I raised you to be." The restaurant erupted in applause as the police cars pulled away. Other diners approached our table, wanting to shake my hand and hear the story of how I'd brought down an international criminal organization. But I felt no satisfaction in their admiration. I'd won a war, but the victory had cost me my son. David would spend the next several years in federal prison, and when he was released, he would have to rebuild his life from nothing. The question was whether he would emerge as a better man or remain the selfish stranger he'd become. Only time would tell. 6 months later, I sat in the witness chair of Buffalo Federal Courthouse, facing a packed gallery as I testified in the trial that had captured national attention. The case against the Blackwood criminal organization had expanded far beyond my personal grievances, uncovering a web of fraud and corruption that stretched across 3 continents and involved dozens of victims. David had pleaded guilty to financial elder abuse and conspiracy charges, accepting a 3-year prison sentence in exchange for his cooperation with federal prosecutors. During his testimony, he'd broken down completely, finally acknowledging the pain he'd caused and expressing genuine remorse for his actions. "I lost sight of everything that mattered," he'd said from the witness stand, his voice barely audible. I betrayed the person who loved me most in the world because I wanted to impress people who saw me as disposable. Madison had shown no such remorse. She'd maintained her innocence until DNA evidence and financial records proved her involvement in crimes spanning 5 years and multiple countries. Her trial had become a media sensation, with reporters documenting every detail of her elaborate fraud schemes. Mrs. Murphy, the prosecutor said as I settled into the witness chair, please tell the court about the impact of these crimes on your life. I looked out at the gallery, seeing faces I recognized from news reports: James Patterson from Texas, whose construction business had been destroyed by Madison's schemes; Michael Rodriguez from California, who'd lost his family home and nearly committed suicide after discovering Madison's betrayal; dozens of other victims whose lives had been shattered by the Blackwood organization's greed. The financial impact was devastating. I began my voice steady despite the emotion of the moment. But the emotional cost was far worse. I spent 27 years raising my son to be kind, honest, and compassionate. Discovering that he'd chosen money over those values was more painful than losing every dollar I'd saved. Have you recovered financially from Mr. Murphy's theft of your savings? Yes, and more. The federal government's asset forfeiture actions against the Blackwood organization resulted in substantial restitution for all victims. I received not only the $38,000 David stole, but an additional $112,000 from Harold Blackwood's seized assets. What did you do with that money? I smiled, thinking about the transformed trajectory of my life. I started a nonprofit organization called Second Chances, which helps elderly victims of family financial abuse. We provide legal assistance, emotional support, and practical resources for seniors who've been exploited by relatives or caregivers. The organization had grown beyond my wildest expectations. With Frank as my business partner and co-founder, we'd helped more than 300 families across 8 states recognize warning signs of financial abuse and protect themselves from exploitation. Our success had attracted grants from major foundations and support from law enforcement agencies nationwide. Mrs. Murphy, do you have any regrets about your decision to pursue justice in this case? I considered the question carefully, thinking about David's current situation and our slowly rebuilding relationship. I regret that my son made choices that led to his imprisonment, but I don't regret holding him accountable for those choices. Consequences teach us what love alone sometimes cannot. Following my testimony, I walked through the courthouse hallway surrounded by reporters and supporters. The story of my investigation had inspired hundreds of similar cases nationwide, as elderly victims found the courage to report family members who'd been stealing from them. Frank waited for me outside the courthouse, his weathered face creased with pride. Our professional partnership had evolved into something deeper over the past months, a companionship built on shared values and mutual respect. How do you feel? He asked as we walked toward his car. Tired, I admitted, but satisfied. Any plans for celebrating? I laughed, thinking about how different my life had become. Actually, I have a book signing this evening. My memoir, Second Chances: A Mother's Fight for Justice, had been published 3 months earlier and immediately became a bestseller. Publishers Weekly called it a gripping true crime story that doubles as an inspiring tale of personal transformation. The advance payment had provided financial security I'd never imagined possible. More importantly, the book had helped thousands of families identify similar situations and protect themselves. I received letters daily from people who'd recognized warning signs of financial abuse after reading my story and taken action to protect their assets. That evening, Barnes& Noble in downtown Buffalo was packed with supporters, crime enthusiasts, and families dealing with their own situations involving financial abuse. During the question and answer session, a middle-aged woman raised her hand. "Mrs. Murphy, my brother has been stealing from our mother's account for 2 years. I have proof, but I'm afraid of destroying our family if I report him. What would you tell someone in my situation?" I considered my response carefully, thinking about everything I'd learned throughout this journey. "Family isn't destroyed by truth," I said finally. "Family is destroyed by lies, betrayal, and the silence that enables abuse to continue. Real love sometimes requires difficult choices, but those choices create opportunities for healing that denial never can." After the signing, Frank and I drove to my new home in the suburbs of Buffalo, a modest but comfortable house I'd purchased with proceeds from my book sales. The cottage featured a garden where I could grow vegetables, a study where I could write, and guest rooms for the victims who sometimes needed temporary shelter while rebuilding their lives. As we sat on the front porch sharing a bottle of wine and watching the sunset, I reflected on the remarkable transformation my life had undergone. At 67 years old, I'd discovered strengths I never knew I possessed and built a purposeful existence from the ashes of betrayal. "Any word from David?" Frank asked gently. I nodded, pulling a letter from my pocket. "He writes every week now. He's been attending counseling programs in prison and working toward his GED. His letters sound different, more like the boy I raised." David's incarceration had been difficult for both of us, but it had also provided an opportunity for reflection and growth that might never have occurred otherwise. His letters showed genuine remorse and a growing understanding of how his choices had hurt not only me but himself. "Do you think he's really changed?" Frank asked. "I think he's beginning to remember who he used to be," I replied. "Whether he chooses to become that person again is up to him." The following week brought news that filled me with satisfaction. Madison had been sentenced to 15 years in federal prison, followed by deportation to Switzerland, where additional charges were pending. Harold Blackwood received a 20-year sentence and forfeiture of his entire criminal empire. Their victims, including James and Michael, had all received substantial restitution that allowed them to rebuild their lives. Klaus Weber, Madison's actual husband, had cooperated fully with authorities and received a reduced sentence in exchange for exposing Swiss banking networks that facilitated American tax evasion. His testimony led to the recovery of more than $60 million hidden in offshore accounts. But perhaps the most meaningful development came 6 months later, when David was granted early release for good behavior and exceptional participation in rehabilitation programs. Frank and I met him at the prison gate, where I saw my son clearly for the first time in 3 years. The arrogant young man who dismissed me from his wedding was gone, replaced by someone humbler but stronger. David had lost weight, but his eyes carried a depth that had been missing during his years of material success. "Mom," he said, simply embracing me with genuine warmth. "I'm sorry. For everything." "I know," I replied, holding him tightly, "and I forgive you." David moved into a halfway house in Buffalo and began working at Second Chances as a volunteer, helping other families navigate the legal and emotional challenges of financial abuse cases. His first-hand experience with both sides of these crimes made him uniquely qualified to counsel victims and their families. Gradually, we rebuilt our relationship on a foundation of honesty rather than obligation. David had learned painful lessons about the difference between success and character, between wealth and worth. His experiences had given him empathy and wisdom that his privileged years had never provided. One evening, as we worked late at the Second Chances office, David looked up from the case files he was reviewing. Mom, do you think I can ever really make up for what I did? I considered his question carefully. You can't change the past, David, but you can choose who you want to be going forward. Every person you help, every family you save from what we went through, that's how you honor the lessons you've learned. David nodded, returning to his work with renewed determination. 2 years later, Second Chances had grown into a national organization with offices in 12 states and partnerships with law enforcement agencies across the country. David had completed his bachelor's degree through a prison education program and was pursuing a master's degree in social work. Our relationship had evolved into something stronger than it had ever been before the crisis. David understood now that love without boundaries enables destruction, while love with consequences creates opportunities for growth. On my 70th birthday, David surprised me with a small ceremony at our Buffalo headquarters. Staff members, volunteers, and families we'd helped gathered to celebrate not just my birthday, but the organization's success in helping more than 2,000 victims recover from financial abuse. 3 years ago, I thought success meant having money and impressing wealthy people, David said during his speech. But real success is using your experiences, even the painful ones, to make other people's lives better. My mother taught me that lesson, even though I was too selfish to understand it at the time. As I looked around the room at faces representing so many stories of recovery and resilience, I felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with purpose. The betrayal that had nearly destroyed me had instead become the foundation for something meaningful and lasting. Frank approached me after the ceremony carrying a small wrapped box. "I have something for you," he said with uncharacteristic shyness. Inside the box was a simple gold ring with a single pearl elegant in its simplicity. "Rosemary Murphy," he said formally, "would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" I looked at this good man who'd stood beside me through the darkest period of my life, who'd helped me find strength I never knew I possessed, who'd become my partner in building something beautiful from something broken. "Yes," I said, slipping the ring onto my finger. "I thought you'd never ask." The room erupted in cheers and applause. David approached us with tears in his eyes, embracing Frank warmly. "Welcome to the family," he said. "Thank you for taking care of my mom when I failed her." Frank's voice was rough with emotion. "She took care of herself, son. She just needed someone who recognized how strong she really was." 6 months later, Frank and I were married in a simple ceremony at the Buffalo Botanical Gardens, surrounded by the people who'd become our chosen family. David, the staff and volunteers from Second Chances victims, we'd helped law enforcement officers we'd worked with, and friends who'd supported us throughout our journey. As I exchanged vows with Frank, I thought about the woman I'd been 3 years earlier, isolated, betrayed, dismissed as harmless trailer trash by people who'd underestimated her completely. That woman was gone, replaced by someone who understood her own worth and refused to accept less than she deserved. During the reception, a reporter from the Buffalo News approached me for an interview about my transformation from crime victim to best-selling author to nonprofit founder. "Mrs. Murphy," she asked, "what would you say to other people who feel powerless against those who've betrayed them?" I considered the question while watching David dance with his girlfriend Sarah, a social worker he'd met through our organization. They were planning a simple wedding next spring, built on shared values rather than financial aspirations. I'd tell them that power isn't about having money or connections or social status, I said finally. Real power comes from understanding your own worth and refusing to accept less than you deserve. Sometimes that means walking away from people who don't value you. Sometimes it means fighting back against those who've wronged you, but it always means believing that you deserve better and taking action to create the life you want. Any final words of advice? I smiled, thinking about everything I'd learned throughout this incredible journey. Life gives us second chances, but only if we're brave enough to take them. I spent 67 years being the person other people expected me to be. Now I'm finally being the person I was meant to be all along. As the evening wound down and Frank and I prepared to leave for our honeymoon in Ireland, David approached me with a small wrapped gift. "I wanted to give you this," he said, his voice soft with emotion. Inside the box was a silver locket containing 2 photographs, one of David as a young boy smiling happily in our old apartment kitchen, and one taken recently of our entire Second Chances team celebrating a successful case resolution. "The boy in the first picture loved you unconditionally," David said. "The man in the second picture loves you with wisdom earned through experience. Both versions are grateful beyond words for the mother who never gave up on teaching them the difference between right and wrong." I hugged my son tightly, this man who'd lost himself completely before finding his way back to the values I'd tried to instill in him. Our relationship would never be the same as it had been before his betrayal, but it was stronger now, built on truth rather than naive trust. As Frank and I drove away from the reception, I thought about the question the reporter had asked. What would I tell people who felt powerless against betrayal? I'd tell them that the most dangerous thing anyone can do is underestimate a person who has nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. I'd tell them that working class doesn't mean weak, that quiet doesn't mean harmless, and that kindness shouldn't be mistaken for stupidity. Most importantly, I'd tell them that justice isn't just about punishment for those who wrong us. Real justice is about refusing to let other people's failures define our worth, about using our experiences to help others, and about building lives of meaning and purpose from whatever materials we have available. I learned that the hard way, but I learned it completely. And now, at 70 years old, married to a wonderful man running a successful organization that helps hundreds of families every year, and surrounded by people who value me for exactly who I am, I can honestly say that betrayal was the best thing that ever happened to me. Because it forced me to discover who I really was underneath all the roles I'd been playing for other people's comfort. And that woman, it turned out, was extraordinary. Before I finish my story, I want to ask you something important. Have you ever experienced betrayal from someone you trusted completely? How did you find the strength to rebuild your life after discovering that the people closest to you weren't who you thought they were? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below, because these experiences connect us in ways that can help others who are facing similar situations. If this story resonated with you, please consider liking this video and subscribing to hear more stories about ordinary people who found extraordinary strength in difficult circumstances. And please share this with anyone who might need to hear that it's never too late to fight for the respect and dignity you deserve. Thank you for listening to my story and for believing that someone like me could make a difference. Remember that your worth isn't determined by how others treat you, but by how you choose to treat yourself. You deserve love, respect, and happiness, and you have more power than you realize to create the life you want. Sometimes the greatest gift we can give ourselves is the courage to start over no matter how late in life that new beginning comes.